My name is Veronica Federico, and I work at the University of Florence, where I lead the Italian team of the research of the EU-financed research Respond that deals with migration management in Europe. And as a research project, we have been investigating in the last almost 3 years about the way in which the European Union and a number of EU member states and a number of extra EU states that are particularly important for the migration-wise, let's say, how we have been responding with the needs of migration and the challenges that migration present to our society. Always think respect dimension, so that we're not concerned about a purely governance perspective, but let's say we are taking into exam the whole migration process and the way in which, from rescue operation, the border management, reception, integration, how our society are facing this challenge. And this is why we decided to discuss the proposed new pact on migration that is under discussion now within the organs of the European Union. And this is tremendously important for us because it could shape the way in which the system of migration governance and the respect of fundamental rights of migrants will exactly be shaped in the next few years. So we thought it could be very interesting and definitely inspiring, put our knowledge as a research project to be challenged by this new pact. And we decided to do this using the expertise that we have in the Respond research and asking for some external support as well. So we have here now 4 distinguished scholars that will discuss parts and aspects of the new pact on migration under different perspectives. And we will be able, during the question and answer session, to add more thoughts, more ideas, and to have more insight into the new pact. Let me, before giving the floor to our first speaker, remind you that with the Respond research, we will hold our final conference in November 20th and 21st, that we will be held online, and you will find all the details to join the conference on the Respond web pages. So I already since now invite you all to engage with our conference in mid-November to discuss more about migration and about the results of our research. This seminar is one of the multiple seminars that we have been holding as a research project in the past few months. So this is in a way a follow-up of our internal discussion, but we are very pleased to realize that the theme in itself is so interesting that we have much widened our audience. So from, let's say, medium-sized webinars, we are now with 88 as of now participants. So the idea of discussing the EU new pact, proposed new pacts on migration, is really something that is interesting for definitely a broader audience. Now let me very briefly present our panelists today. First, the first speaker will be Professor Umut Korkut, who is the team leader of the Respond Research Unit based in Glasgow, UK, and he is professor of international politics at the Glasgow Caledonian University. He will be followed by Jean-Pierre Gauci, who is a senior researcher fellow at the British Institute of International and Comparative Law in London. Am I correct, Jean-Pierre? Is it based in London, isn't it?
Yes, yes, it is.
Yes, great. And then it will be the turn of Professor Chiara Favilli, a scholar of European law that works with the University of Florence and is part of the research team of the University of Florence and dealing with the Italian case studies and the EU level case studies. And then our panel will be closed by Bernd who has just obtained his PhD. So this is the occasion of publicly congratulating with him, and cultural anthropologist, but his main research is exactly on more border and migration research and the European dimension of border and border management. So obviously he will be talking today with us on borders management and of his research. So I will ask concerning our organization, we have asked our panelists to be as brief as possible and to maintain a maximum of 15 minutes to their speech, to have something like half an hour of answer and question. If you have an answer, please write it in the chat, and it will be Dr. Paola Pannia from the University of Florence, who, after our four panelists, who will go through the questions and will voice the question. So don't worry, she will read aloud your question. She may summarize some parts or may merge some question in order to make the Q&A section more clear. Please, in the case you wanna prepare a question for a specific speaker, mention it in the chat so it will be easier for Paola to understand to whom the question should be addressed. I think I've said all I wanted to say. And once again, on behalf of the whole Respond research team, welcome to our webinar. And I leave now the floor to Professor Korkut. Umut, is your turn now.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for the good introduction, Veronica. So let me just share my screen now. Okay. I think my screen is clear, but I can't see the rest. Okay. Hi, everyone. So my name is Umut Korkut. As Veronica has introduced me, I'm a professor of international politics at Glasgow Caledonian University. Within the Respond project, I've been responsible with leading research on Hungary as well as co-leading research on UK with our partners in Cambridge. And today, actually, at this for this webinar, I prepared some inferences from the work package that I'm leading with the Austrian Academy of Sciences. That's called Conflict and Conceptualizations of Europeanization. Otherwise, GC is co-leading the work package 2 within Respond on European EU border management practices with Göttingen University in Germany. So actually, the webinar fell in right time with us finalizing the reports for this work package, which looks into practically how politicians have been framing the future of Europe or their ideas about the future of Europeanization with respect to external migration. So our reports will be made public soon. I think next week we'll be releasing 12 our reports already. And then within the next few weeks, we'll be releasing reports on Germany, Austria, Hungary, Poland, Italy, Sweden, and a few other, Greece and a few other countries. So in this, for this webinar, actually, what I tried to do is that I tried to go through the reports for the work package 6, and I tried to somehow locate certain kind of tropes and slogans within these reports, and then to see what kind of affinity we can draw from these tropes and slogans into the new migration pact. Mind you, at the moment, actually, these reports are pretty much counter reports. So we've been looking into the political discourse and how the political discourse is carried away with the media discourse in 7 countries that we study. And then hereby, I mean, what I want to do is that I like to promote, or I'd like to in a way harness certain slogans and tropes, and then to see ways, basically, whether there is any affinity with respect to the migration pact. So just to start with what we came across within the reports that we reviewed and we wrote so far. I mean, this is obviously rather simple, but I mean, in a way, this is kind of the aggregate composition of the narratives that have been in circulation within the period that we've been studying the migration narratives within 7 countries under work package 6 focus. So there's a wide-scale agreement, especially within the countries that are at the EU's border zones, which are Hungary, Italy, Greece, as well as Poland to a certain extent, that EU border security is a must. So the politicians, they don't seem to want to concede border security, and they emphasize border security as member states' responsibility, whether it is on land border or maritime border. Now, there's some emphasis on humanitarianism, and we came across this humanitarianism emphasis in Austria and Germany, and to a certain extent in other places like Hungary, but it's only for those that deserve. And when it comes to explaining who deserves this thing, there seems to be a kind of a variation across the countries that are at the border, as well as the countries that are host, in terms of whether whether to prevent those before they immigrate, and then to assist those before they make the perilous journeys, as they call, or to extend humanitarianism for the vulnerables. And this kind of trope is pretty common, but we haven't really come across any correlation between humanitarianism and vulnerability in the case of Hungary, for example. So the other thing that comes out is pretty much national sovereignty should prevail over supranationalism. This is pretty much shared all across. Even, for example, German politicians, they agree that the Visegrad countries, they should proceed with their national sovereignty, and then they should not be told, they should not be imposed by the European Commission or international NGOs, because these countries, they should have their sovereignty to protect their borders against the irregular migrants. Now, EU-Turkey deal or Italy-Libya deal are pretty much praised all across. And then they all, as I'm going to introduce you further within the EU Migration Pact as well, these seem to be the kind of deals that Commission seem to be now putting an emphasis in terms of best practice. Now, countries differ in terms of, how, to what extent they endorse labor and talent migration having an economic value, and to what extent they actually fully reject this thing. The countries that fully reject labor and talent migration, they say that, I mean, we can't really outsource our future population needs to third countries who are going to send migrants to Europe without any cultural affinity, whereas some countries that seem to be pretty much in the host countries like Italy and Germany and Sweden, they seem to realize that they seem to make a case that labor or talent migration may have an economic value. We're going to see this thing in the EU Migration Pact as well. Now, there seems to be an agreement on the fact that there are just too many undocumented people, and then they stay within Europe and they should be sent back. Now, let's see actually what kind of affinity we can draw upon from these national tropes and slogans to the EU Migration Pact. I mean, I tried to summarize this thing, and I know that the colleagues are going to discuss EU migration pact, more broadly. But I mean, there seem to be six kind of issues that came to my attention. And then there is a very clear emphasis on border security within the EU migration pact. And then there seems to be an emphasis on coordination to protect the Mediterranean border. This does not seem to follow what we came across in the country reports for our work package called Conflicting Conceptualizations of Europeanization, because there doesn't seem to be an emphasis on member states being kind of responsible, but there's talk about a supranational kind of organized around Frontex mechanism to protect the European borders. And there's an emphasis on Mediterranean border, because in the document we see that the Commission is approaching Western Balkan countries as the future Europe, EU. So they are talking about investing in their national mechanisms. Now, just to briefly go through, humanitarianism is mentioned, but it is delegated to efficient asylum decisions at the border. So simply, efficiency seems to prevail over humanitarian considerations. And there is some mention about vulnerability, but this only comes out in terms of children and those in need. However, for example, an LGBT issue that could be classified as vulnerability does not seem to come out in the document. Now, sovereignty, there seems to be an interest in pooling national sovereignty priorities into the migration pact, and this continues with promoting European way of life agenda. There seems to be a widespread praise for externalization agreements, such as the one that was signed between Turkey and European Commission, and recommendations to further them, especially towards sub-Saharan Africa. There is an emphasis on talent and labor migration. So European Commission names legal migration, actually, only talent and labor related migration, and effectively excludes unregulated migration from its scope of legality. And then there's an emphasis on efficient and coordinated returns, and this receives almost utmost emphasis. Almost 2/3 of the document is actually about returns. Now, in terms of how it replicates what we came across in the reports that we're reviewing so far, it seems to follow the line in terms of externalization, and then it also seems to follow the line in terms of humanitarianism. It seems to follow the line that the host countries, such as Sweden, Germany, or Austria, follow so far in terms of talent and labor migration, but it does not necessarily pay attention to the migration reject countries such as Hungary, which would reject migration under any circumstances. And in terms of the returns and the efficiency and coordination demands and returns, it seems to follow the line that the countries, the politicians in the countries that we studied have been putting across. Just finally, some general reflections. Is this a sedated moment for the European Union? I mean, is the European Union now conceding fully with the populist politicians? And is this an attempt to reach out to them to append their agendas to the future course of Europeanization in migration governance, at least? I'm also a principal investigator for another Horizon 2020 project called Demos, Varieties of Populism in Europe and beyond. So I try to inform this discussion actually with considering this Demos research as well, and then somehow started to believe that actually the Commission at the moment is trying to reach out to the populist politicians, and then somehow perhaps thinking that if they can reach out to them, they may stop the future prevalence of populism in Europe. Now, it contextualizes humanitarian obligations of European Union within a crisis frame. So this is very, very clear. I mean, the Commission is not interested in replicating what happened in 2015, and it talks about resilience in order to prevent future crises in terms of facing an abrupt increase in the number of irregular arrivals. Now, it classifies employment and talent migration as legal migration, and then effectively that delegates asylum applications to efficient decisions on status at the border. And if you consider actually the border countries are pretty much those countries that are having very, very grave human rights violations, such as Hungary, I can't really see how this efficiency would actually endorse humanitarian obligations. It talks about pre-screening. We see a health identification and security checks mentioned. Probably this is in line with the COVID pandemic, but this also assumes that all arrivals would have their appropriate documents in place. And I don't really see how irregular migrants can really bring these documents so that there would be a screening of their health checks, for example, at the border. It talks about harmonization of rules with third countries. I found this very ambiguous agenda. It raises questions on externalization and state sovereignty in transit states. I couldn't really understand to what extent the EU was ready to externalize its rules to countries where state sovereignty are weak, are hindered, such as Libya and such as the West Balkan countries, or else, collaborate with those countries with such corruption in their systems like Turkey when it comes to harmonize its rules. All right, so that's me then. I don't know whether I finished it in the allocated amount of time, but thanks for listening.
Brilliant, Umut. Thank you. You have been extremely fast. Definitely your allocated time, and definitely informative on the Europeanization and the European dimension of this new pact. So now I think we should leave the floor to Jean-Pierre, who will provide another entrance, another perspective on where to go in details into the new pact. So Jean-Pierre, up to you now.
Thank you very much, Veronica, and thank you very much to you and the organizers for inviting me to be here. As introduced, I'm Jean-Pierre Gauci. I'm the Arthur Watts Senior Research Fellow in Public International Law at the British Institute of International and Comparative Law. My main area of research within migration tends to be around issues of borders and access to protection, and then around issues of human trafficking. But today I'm going to be speaking quite a bit on the issue of resettlement, primarily focusing on the recommendation that is part of the Pact on resettlement, as well as humanitarian admission and other forms of legal pathways to protection. My presentation today will build on kind of an initial reading of the recommendation, some of my initial thoughts. I've kind of written them down, but I think that would take me quite a bit longer than the 15 minutes allocated to go through. But the presentation also builds on some of the work that I did a few years ago with colleagues at BICL and at the King's College London, focusing on legal pathways. And this was done kind of at a time in 2017, so after the 2015 dynamics, but at a time when the UK and other countries were also thinking about legal pathways. The previous action plans, etc., had mentioned the importance of resettlement. But as we will see also in this recommendation, we have a mention of resettlement. We know that resettlement is an important pathway, but we do not put enough ambition in that. And I think that is something that carries across to today as well. So what I would like to do is, first of all, run you through a little bit of context of legal pathways. Then I want to focus a bit more on the recommendation, and specifically the kind of the subtitles in the recommendation and some of the initial thoughts that I have about it. And then finally, I'll run through some principles that I think as researchers, as academics, and as activists in NGOs and civil society organizations, we should keep in mind when we're thinking about how resettlement and other legal pathways are put into practice. But just to start by way of context, so resettlement is nothing new. We see resettlement as one of the durable solutions mentioned by UNHCR over the past few decades. We know that resettlement is something that the EU has mentioned in previous instruments as well. And we have a significant part of the Global Compact on Refugees, which focuses on resettlement. So the idea is not that the EU is reinventing the wheel or is creating something new when it talks about resettlement and humanitarian admission, but it is rather building on a pretty well-established framework within the international community of dealing with people who are living in refugee camps and people who are in need of protection and who need some form of permanence of that protection. However, the reality is that even if it is well established, the practice of resettlement remains that the number of people being resettled is far, far, far short of the number of people that UNHCR deems to be in need of resettlement. Now, that is already a kind of a low bar in terms of the people that probably we would consider as people working in this field, as people working with migrants and refugees. We would probably consider a considerably higher number of people to be in need of resettlement than UNHCR considers. But even if we look at the low threshold that UNHCR considers, we are still looking at a very small percentage of that number being resettled in any given year. So just to give you an idea, according to UNHCR, at the end of 2019, there were 1.45 million people in need of resettlement around the globe. And that was an increase of 50% over the same number in 2010. In the first quarter of 2020, there were 3,900 refugees resettled into the European Union, and that figure dropped considerably after that because of COVID-19. The resettlement pledge for 2020 in the European Union was of 29,500. So 29,500 places pledged by the EU, 1.45 million people in need of resettlement according to UNHCR. So we can already see a significant gap there. The other thing that also underpins the recommendation very much is COVID-19, and we see COVID-19 as resulting in a reduction of the number of people being resettled, and we see calls now by NGOs, so the International Rescue Committee, for example, UNHCR and others, saying that, okay, now that we are kind of dealing with COVID-19, we also need to start resettlement again. Now, when we talk about resettlement and legal pathways, we have two underlying principles that I think we need to keep in mind. So one is the protection of fundamental rights, the idea of these are people that are in need of protection, and we are offering a channel for them to arrive at that protection without having to go through smugglers and without having to take dangerous journeys. And we all know the number of deaths at sea that we see in the Mediterranean and in the Aegean, for example. And the other is the question of solidarity and responsibility sharing, both within the EU, but more importantly with countries of transit and countries which are hosting significant numbers of refugees. So just moving quickly to the recommendation itself. The recommendation is very broadly split into two. So you have a preamble, which includes a lot of, to put it politely, patting ourselves on the back about how much the EU has done in this context of resettlement and how much is being done. And then the second part, which comes to the actual recommendation. And I'll focus on that because I think that is the more operational part of this. And I've put on the slides the kind of the subtitles of that section. So in terms of the first one, so increasing the number of member states engaged in resettlement, I think here, and humanitarian admission. Here, what we see in the EU is that only a few member states are involved in resettlement, and most member states, in fact, do not resettle anyone or resettle very, very small numbers of people. So there's an imbalance between what different member states are doing in this context, and part of what the recommendation is trying to do is achieve a slightly better balance between different member states. The second is stepping up implementation in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, which I mentioned. And this is interesting because the recommendation says, okay, we need to step up implementation despite COVID-19. What the recommendation also does is it basically conflates 2020 and 2021. And what it says is that basically the target that was set for 2020, which is 29,500, is now the target until the end of 2021. Put differently, the EU is skipping a year in terms of pledging resettlement places. And we're not talking about, huge numbers of resettlement places. We're talking about under 30,000 places, which is now going to be the target for 2 years. Whether we will meet that target is a different question. Another kind of key point is ensuring quality resettlement programs, and a lot of this is about information that is provided, but also about integration. And I'll come back to the question of integration in a little bit, but I think one of the key strengths of resettlement and humanitarian admission programs is that it does facilitate kind of the link between arrival and integration a lot more than spontaneous arrivals do. The other thing the recommendation does is it links and it promotes humanitarian admission and complementary pathways. So humanitarian admission is things like humanitarian corridors, like we've seen in Italy, France, and Belgium, whilst complementary pathways are using channels that exist in the migration side of things, in the legal migration side of things, but using those to also facilitate access to EU territory for refugees and people in need of international protection. So that includes issues around labor, for example, and issues around education. The recommendation also focuses on strengthening cooperation, both internally and externally. And again, here we start seeing a bit of a problem, well, we're starting a significant problem, in my opinion, with kind of making resettlement a condition for the way we deal with third countries in terms of migration, and whether resettlement becomes a carrot or a stick for states to do what we want them to do in terms of migration control, for example. There's a role for the European Commission in the recommendation to monitor what is going on, and also, and I think this is quite important, the question of financial support as well as operational support from organizations like EASO, as well as international organizations. So UNHCR and IOM are mentioned specifically. UNHCR is particularly relevant here because obviously the main resettlement program around the world is managed by UNHCR, and this is the main channel through which EU member states are resettling refugees. We must also bear in mind that the UNHCR resettlement program took a significant hit over the past few years when the Trump administration significantly cut the number of people that were resettled to the US, and the US had been the main country of resettlement in that program, which is also how the EU can now boast that it is one of the main countries of resettlement, although obviously we're talking about all 28 member states. And I mentioned 28 member states not only because of denial of Brexit, but also because the UK is one of the main countries, is the country which takes in the largest share of that resettlement figure. So it is something that is going to affect how the EU does in terms of resettlement when we talk about pure numbers, just because of the role that the UK has played in that space over the past years. Sorry about that. So moving on.
I'm sorry, you've got 2 minutes.
Yeah. So just moving on, as we think about the proposals and in terms of making resettlement more real, there's a number of principles that we identified in this research that we did a few years ago. And I'll just mention 2 key ones. So one is the question of accessibility, making sure that information, for example, about resettlement and humanitarian admission opportunities is available in both in a language that people understand, but also in the spaces where people are living at any given time. And we know that you know, people in need of protection are not only in the specific places where we'd like them to be and where we can share that information easily. And the second point that I'll focus on is procedural safeguards, making sure that the resettlement processes are based around clear criteria, that the, arbitrariness is avoided, that discrimination is avoided, and that if, you know, the criteria against which decisions are made are clear, are consistent, are transparent, and that people can challenge decisions to not resettle that person. And I'll stop there because I've run out of time, but I'm happy to answer any further questions. Thank you very much, Veronica.
Thanks so much, Jean-Pierre. And now from resettlement we move, remaining in the domain of legal studies, to the revision of the Dublin system. Isn't it, Chiara, that you will deal with this? And the floor now is to Professor Chiara Favilli from the University of Florence.
Thank you, Veronica. It is a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you also for involving me in the Italian team of the Respond project. And thank you also to the previous speakers for the very interesting insights. Is the EU's new migration pact a remedy? I think it is really very difficult to answer, and I think it depends a remedy for what. This is what I would like to try to answer with my presentation. What is sure is that the new Pact on Migration and Asylum pursues the same goals as the previous pact, or better, the previous agenda adopted in the past years. In particular, the pact pursues the aim of fighting irregular entries and abusive asylum applications, and moreover, stemming migratory flows towards the European Union. And these goals are pursued by strengthening the cooperation with third countries of origin and transit, the cooperation that should focus on preventing people leaving their countries and then getting to the European Union, but also on readmission, with a lot of efforts that the European Union is putting on returns, also with a major role that will be played by Frontex. And we have to mention this is still lacking in the new pact in a new provision on legal channels that besides the readmission, the resettlement, sorry. And in particular, there is the lacking of economic migration, the legal channel for economic migration besides high qualified workers. A public consultation has been announced for next year, and we will look forward this public consultation, and in particular, we will look for what will follow this public consultation that I think would be a very important piece of legislation. These goals are pursued by several measures that have been published the same day that the pact has been published. And these measures, as we know, include binding and non-binding acts. And we have to add to these measures some of the 2016 package proposals that should be resumed starting from the point where the negotiations was broken down at the end of the past EU legislature. This is the case of the qualification directive and the reception directive, for instance. But I will focus now only on the Dublin system that, as we know, is one of the pillars of the EU asylum law. As far as the Dublin system, we have a completely new proposal that has been put forward by the Commission, together with new instruments to apply the principle of solidarity among member states. So we have a new draft regulation on migration management that is now on the table, repealing the Dublin regulation that is now in force and redrafting the system in a completely new framework. And it is evident the will to close the Dublin era with all the tensions and conflicts between member states. Dublin has failed, it is dead, and these are the words spoken not by only academics, NGOs, but spoken also by the commissioners presenting the pact, and particularly the proposal on the Dublin. And it is true that Dublin has failed, and probably it's true also that it is dead. So it is good that we have now a completely new proposal. And so what is the content of this proposal? We have to say that if it is true that the regulation now in force is probably going to be repealed, we will have always something like the Dublin system, because the existing criteria are to be recasted, including the problematic one, the problematic criteria about the consisting on the state of first irregular entry. 3 new criteria are added to connected to family links, and 1 to the possession of educational diplomas. There are exemption clauses that now that should be repealed or restricted, and sanctions for those who circumvent the application of the criteria, and in this case only minimum standard of reception will apply. So the general idea is to have stricter rules to apply the criteria and to ensure the cooperation among member states. So if this is the Dublin system that we already know with some changes, we have, there is in the draft regulation something completely new. And because these criteria, the criteria that are already there and the new criteria, do not apply in the two following situations. When a state is under pressure or at risk of pressure, or when a state is in a situation of crisis. And in another case, the other situation is when the entry of a person happens after search and rescue operations. This is very important, but this is not a surprise because already in the European Council meeting of the 28th June 2018, the heads of state or government agreed in the paragraph 12 of the conclusions, the following, I read with you. A consensus needs to be found, a double regulation, to reform it based on a balance of responsibility and solidarity, taking into account the persons disembarked following search and rescue operations. So the agreement at the political level was already there, and the same agreement had been reiterated also by the European Council, the Council, and also by this Commission. So it is not a surprise that we have a particular regime, particular rules that will apply in the case of entry after search and rescue operations. So we know how many problems we have had, in particularly with a particular government in Italy with search and rescue operations. But we have always had a lot of problems with search and rescue operations in the past 20 years. So it's not only a problem of the one government that is leading a country in a certain period. So what happens in these situations? Well, in these situations, the principle of solidarity applies, and we have a particularly content of the principle of solidarity, because the principle of solidarity should apply in different ways and always under the direction of the European Commission. What is sure is that member states have the duty to cooperate, but they can choose how to cooperate. So member states can decide to cooperate on relocation, and so they will accept the transfer of asylum applicants into their country. And the model is the Malta Agreement of September 2019. And in this case, solidarity means reception of aliens, means sharing the burden of reception. And the Commission will adopt an annual plan, so trying to predict the needs of state and also the available places that member states declare to accept. So the Commission stressed a lot this point of having a predictable scheme, a predictable pathway for cooperation. But those member states who do not want to relocate asylum application, we know that there are member states who do not want to cooperate on relocation, have an option, an alternative option to cooperate and to cooperate on returns. And these member states should choose to sponsor returns. In this case, they assume the responsibility of return of an aliens. And if after 8 months the sponsorship has proven ineffective, then the regularly staying person should be transferred to that member state. I think this is very difficult to apply. I'm not sure that it will apply effectively. But member states should also choose other alternative forms of cooperation, in particular material cooperation, funding, facilities, and so on. So there is a different way to cooperation, and the idea is to involve all member states, and also establishing the share of each member state following the criteria of 50% of population, 50% of GDP. So this is completely new. Of course, we already knew the relocation, and we also knew the returns, but the way in which they are shaping now, it is really different. Will this new system be a remedy? Coming back to the original question and the question of this seminar. Well, I think it depends for what, a remedy for what. I think it will be a remedy to the impasse in the negotiations in the Council. The Commission, I think, has found a very brilliant way to get on board all the member states and so get to the approval of the reform package if the agreement with the European Parliament can be reached. And the German presidency, that is now under this semester, would like to reach a political agreement under this semester, under the following 2 meetings of the Council. And it is likely that the member states opposing to the previous reform will now accept this proposal. Southern states, because there is a new system applying new rules for those entering after search and rescue operations, northern and eastern countries, because they can opt for cooperation on return. And I would like to stress in this regard that it is not clear how much the burden of return would be put on the member states, because I think and I guess that a major role will be played by Frontex. So I think that the European Commission will cover all the costs of return, because I can see another value in return given by Hungary or Poland when migration and when people have to be returned to African countries. So I think that there will be a formal involvement of Eastern countries, but I think that the action will be will be played by Frontex and by the EU budget. But we will see, because I haven't read it yet. So yes, I'm going to finish. Will this new system be a remedy to the EU migration and asylum crisis? I do not think so. The system is always very complex, and at the end of the day, it is based on voluntary cooperation by member states, cooperation return, cooperation relocation. We know all the problems related to relocation and related to return. So I think that the true remedy, and we can say the strong instrument also to manage, to cope with the migration crisis is the cooperation with third countries of origin and transit in order to stemming the flows of migrants and asylum seekers and to cooperate on returns. I think that the main instrument, the main goal, but what is the key to let the system play and function is reducing the number of arrivals, in particular of irregular entries. I would like to highlight that the number of irregular arrivals in the EU went from over 1.8 million in 2015 to around 142,000 in 2019. It's only a decrease of 92%. So now there are good conditions for approval of the package. But what I would like to stress, and I'm going to finish, that only with a small number of arrivals, the system can be managed. It will be easier to find cooperation relocation. Secondary movements will be more tolerated. Irregular migrants will be more tolerated. The efforts of returns could be concentrated on a lower number of persons. So reducing the number of arrivals to let the system function, including also the Schengen system. So against this framework, and I conclude with this, I do hope, we do hope that there will be some concrete results in the next future also on legal migration. That is also another way to fight against the irregular entries, but is another way that the European Commission, the European Union has not yet decided to start. Thank you, Veronica.
Thanks, Chiara. Thanks a lot. So we move now somehow very in a very consistent way to discuss with Bernd whether the new pact is a remedy from the perspective of the border management. So what's the novelty for the border management, and what remain the crucial issue? Is there any solution proposed? What's your perspective, Bernd?
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yep. Yes.
Yeah, good. Great. Well, thank you for having me here. Thank you for organizing this seminar. I think it's very, very timely that we discuss this new pact at the end of our long research we have conducted together. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak a little bit about the aspects of border management, or European integrated border management, as the Commission would phrase it in this particular communication. Now, before I step into the actual proposals, I would like to make a little introduction, because if you read this Commission communication, the 2026-09, which is like the overarching document, I find it very interesting that despite a strong emphasis on borders, which has already been mentioned by the speakers before me, it's very interesting that it says very, very little about borders, in fact. However, I would make the argument that, in fact, you cannot read the entire document without having or interpreting it against the background of now 20 years of Europeanized migration and border policies, because the language and the mechanisms and the rationalities which you can find throughout the documents, I'm accepting the parts on integration and legal migration, because I think they belong to a different field of policy here. If you study those rationalities and arguments and figures, I find that the history of the European border as an object of governance speaks very strongly out of this document. And I would like to make a second comment before we start. I think it's very important to understand that this is a document that is written by the European Commission, and I think it's very important to note that, unlike, for example, in the United States, the European Commission, of course, does not represent a strong federal government, which has the capacities, competences, and powers to actually push through the solution. So also from this aspect, I find the new pact on migration and asylum very, very interesting, because I think it highlights very strongly what I would describe as a lateral or orthogonal movement by the Commission, precisely trying to situate the development of migration, asylum, and border policies, which are sketched out in this document, not in the predominant dichotomy between national and European competences, but that again, and also this is something that the Commission has been doing for a decade now, is trying to find a way to sketch out a European policy without directly attacking or taking away or threatening to take away national sovereignty. So I think this is a very, very interesting document, which, however, should be interpreted also in this way. Now, after this little introduction, I would like, if we turn to the actual pact, new pact, and the Commission communication 2026-09, where kind of all the elaborate plans of the European Commission are laid down, there's a section 4 which is called integrated border management. So naturally, this would be the section I was drawn to first, and it has 4 subsections. So the first one is stepping up the effectiveness of EU external borders, and that, of course, mainly concerns the European Agency the European Border Agency Frontex. It has a second section which reads, and I think this is very interesting also, reaching full interoperability of IT systems. So suddenly here we understand that the question of the border is also very much a question of database systems. Let me get back to this. The third point is a common European approach to search and rescue. So I would say this is the actual novelty which we can find in this document as compared to previous European discussions, especially by the Commission. And the fourth point is also a familiar point, which is called a well-functioning Schengen area. Now, the important thing is none of these four, let's call it initiatives of the European Commission, have attached any kind of very concrete policy proposal, like a proposal for a regulation or even very specific. There are some guidelines proposed by the Commission, but there is no legislative texts in there which are to be adopted as part of the adoption of the new Pact of Asylum and Migration. And my argument would be is that going to the first section on Frontex, of course the Commission wishes for Frontex to be more effective. It calls for the mandate of, it calls for the staffing of Frontex, which the last Frontex regulation of 2019 allows and the multi-annual financial framework allows for the agency to hire up to 10,000 border guards, which of course is a precedent, a new precedent in the European Union, having a European agency which with so many law enforcement staff on its roster. Of course, it calls for the agency to become fully operational, but surprisingly, or not surprisingly, we can discuss this, there is not a call for a new mandate for the agency. And my argument would be, like if we think about the surprise, why is there not a call for a new mandate? I would argue that the last two mandate reforms of the agency in 2016 and 2019 have pushed the legal limits of what a European agency in justice and home affairs, so migration and border policies in this respect, as closely as possible to what is allowed by the Lisbon Treaty. So there is no, constitutionally speaking, there is no possibility or very little possibility, I think, for the expansion or further expansion of the mandate of the agency. And I think the fact that the Commission only asks for the agency Frontex to become fully operational in this respect reveals this. Now, the second point, which I find very interesting, is the reaching of reaching the full interoperability of IT systems. The Commission mentioned 6 databases which have been created over the last 30 years. That's the entry-exit system. This is the European Travel Information and Authorization System, the Visa Information System, the European Criminal Records Information System for third country nationals, of course, Eurodac, and the Schengen Information System. These 6 border databases, I would call them, are supposed to be fully interoperable so that information between these databases can be exchanged. Again, though, there is no proper legislative proposal attached to this text. And I would again make the argument that all the necessary legislative changes for the interoperability and the interlinking of these databases have already been effected in 2016 and 2017. So this is why you see there is no real movement here. These are the uncontroversial points after the summer of migration. These have already been pushed through the Council and the European Parliament, and it's just a matter of implementing them now. The third pillar, which the Commission proposes, I think is interesting in the respect that the Commission calls for a common European approach to search and rescue. So I think that this can really show how civil society activities, particularly the civilian rescue fleet, which has been established and again criminalized in the Mediterranean, can actually find a representation on European level and create a different discourse. So I was very interested to read this. And of course, the fourth point, a fully functioning or well-functioning Schengen area addresses a long-running problem, which we have seen in the European Union, that Schengen is perpetually in crisis and remains to be in crisis. The interesting aspect of what the Commission proposes here is that the long struggle to turn the European border, or what used to be the border of the member states of the European Union, into a European border with a shared responsibility for the Commission and Council, is fully evident in this text now by the Commission, because clearly the Commission takes the initiative to restore Schengen to its normal way of functioning. It will present a strategy on the future of Schengen. It will convene a Schengen Forum. So very clearly, the formerly and for a long time intergovernmental Schengen system will be properly or more Europeanized through this proposal of the European Commission, if the Commission gets its way. But as I said before, and I know that I'm running out of time, this doesn't seem like very much, right? If we look at European migration policy documents of the last 20 years, it has always been that they have asked for a strengthened or reinforced border, for a more European approach to border management. And you might want to argue that this document that we are looking at right now marks a point of departure. However, I would make a different argument. I would like, or if you follow me, or let me entertain you with this thought, I believe that precisely because the notion of a strong external border and the policing of a strong external border is so deeply intertwined with all migration policy in the European Union, we can understand that certain mechanisms of European governance, which have been established through 20 years of Europeanized borders, are now starting to seep into related domains such as migration policy and asylum policy. So, for example, the hotspot approach, which was adopted after 2015 and was one of the major innovations in border management, if you allow me to speak like this, you can see that this is being extended now, not under this name, but understanding that the European border, and that means the migration at the same time always, is constantly in crisis, and that this crisis requires specific mechanisms. The Commission refers to either crisis or force majeure. So basically acknowledging that there is an external force acting on Europe, which is not entirely controllable by the European Union, even if usually nationalist rhetoric would suggest otherwise. And in these moments of crisis, which we know are periodically reproduced at the border and through the border, the Commission argues for different means of intervention, more Europeanized means of intervention, and also for extra legal standards that will then have to be applied. So the blueprint for crisis preparedness and force majeure sketches out something which you might want to refer to as a Carl Schmittchen model of border governance and migration governance in the European Union. That is, if you can call for a crisis, you are allowed to change the laws, you can apply different legal standards. And I think this is a very, very dangerous precedent that the Commission tries to anchor in the political discourse here. It's not that we did not have this crisis rhetoric before, but this is the first time that the Commission is actually proposing to put it into a legislative context. That there is a concrete proposal for a regulation. You can also see that asylum policy.
Bernd,
yeah, 2 minutes.
Yeah, well, yes, one.
One, okay, right. You can also see that through the proposed asylum policies, such as screening and the combination of border procedures of asylum and return into one legislative proposal, we see the European border emerge as a spatial object where, again, different legal systems are to be erected. And then I will make the last point. I think what you can read also very strongly in the document is that the Commission is entirely happy with its approach of European governance through agencies. So Frontex, in this context, is seen as a success model, and it will be replicated now in asylum, for example, through the creation of the European Union Agency for Asylum. And this is not just, I'm just not just referring to the term agency here. You can also see that related mechanisms such harmonization and since 2010 evaluation mechanisms and monitoring mechanisms are also increasingly mentioned by the European Commission, which I would say warrants for a separate and detailed investigation into these new legitimacy devices and rationalities of European governance, which blink up quite a lot in this new pact on migration and asylum. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bernd. Really, thank you so much. So now we are moving to the last part of our seminar, that is the Q&A session. So let's get more into a debate. In opening the debate and in thanking again all our speakers, all our presenters for their fantastic and for the intervention, I will just, let's say, abuse my position and make the first question, not having written in the chat, as I suggested all the others to do. And just asking all the panelists whether in this proposed new pact, there is any space for migrants agency. Are we still conceiving migrants as mere recipient? Or are we moving ahead, recognizing their slight, a power of age, well, their right to agency to decide about their future, for example. So is there any space for agency in the new pact? And then I move, so you put it on your answering list, and then I ask Paola to start with the questions. Paola.
Yes. I would like to say thank you to everybody for the questions. There is the first question from Rubana on externalization. So she asked whether externalization and the border regime can be seen as a strategic move to curb the wave of nationalism within the EU countries, and especially that of the Eastern Europe. Then there are two questions for Jean-Pierre Gauci. The first one about the human rights of unaccompanied minors. And the second one instead is again from Rubana. She asks whether the recommendation elaborate on any plan on how EU will enforce all its members to participate to the resettlement. I think that maybe we can stop here, and then I will start with the second round of questions, right?
Of course, as brief as possible in terms of answering, so that we have more space for more questions. Thanks.
I can go first. On the question of human rights of unaccompanied minors. So as far as I remember, the recommendation on resettlement does not make specific mention of unaccompanied minors, but there is kind of this constant reference in kind of anything to do with resettlement on the question of vulnerability. And the concern I have about that is that the understanding, definition, call it what you may, of vulnerability is a bit fungible, and it does change depending on the circumstance. I think the other thing to keep in mind also when we're talking about human rights of unaccompanied minors in this context is that we cannot take the European asylum system separately from the member states and the EU's international obligations, as well as the international obligations of the countries in which those unaccompanied minors find themselves, both under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but also under the broader human rights instruments. And I think particularly interesting here is, I think it's General Comment number 6, which talks about how the Convention applies to unaccompanied and separated children. On the question of agency, I think there is some nods towards tokenistic involvement of trying to get some views from some migrants in some situations, but I don't think it goes past that. So I don't think the Pact or kind of the efforts generally do much in that context. We do see some movement in the context of integration, for example, and the European Commission trying to gather more migrant voices, but again, the impact of those migrant voices on actual policy remain to be seen. And then I think the other question was on whether there's anything to basically force member states in the context of resettlement. And the short answer is no. The recommendation is very much written in kind of softer terms of should and are invited to, are encouraged to, etc. So it's a very much a carrot approach rather than a stick approach. And the carrot includes things like operational support, as well as funding, including kind of a cash amount that goes with every person you resettle, which is a way to incentivize states, but is not obviously a punishment system. And I think the issue there comes also down to the balance across the Pact between resettlement and relocation. So there's very much this idea of solidarity within the EU of countries taking from other EU member states. And it's very much kind of a zero-sum game. The way I read the Pact generally is an understanding of this as a zero-sum game. So if 10 people are resettled, then 10 less people will be relocated. And the emphasis is clearly on internal solidarity, which makes resettlement the kind of ugly cousin that we have to mention, but we're not actually going to deal with seriously, or we're not going to make recommendations that are going to be particularly effective in increasing to a significant degree and to a level which is of kind of a meaningful level, the amount of resettlement that the EU does. And I think part of that also comes from the instrument that is proposed, right? Here we have a recommendation, we don't have a legislative text, and part of that is because when we did have a legislative text that failed to get the political consensus between the Council and the Parliament. And if you look at the legislative chain, it's clear that where it got stuck, which is at the Council, and some member states were kind of very keen on blocking it. I'll stop there.
Veronica, I can answer very briefly to Claudia Di Matteo about policy of integration. And of course, the Pact cannot change the treaty, and so the competence on integration is one of the weakest competence of the European Union. It is a competence to support member state, to coordinate member state policy. So, as you suggest, also integration keeps to be a competence mainly ruled by member states by national law. However, the Pact devoted one chapter to integration, and the Commission plans to publish a new plan on integration for the period 2021 to 2025, supporting member states and giving member state guidelines on integration. And probably what will be more interesting is the proposal to include the integration measures, integration proposal inside the agreement with social parties. That is one pillar of the EU social policy. I think this could be something new and something very important to follow, considering the EU integration policy.
Nobody wants to reply to the question about the externalization. The first question. In any case, there are other questions. So to Kasparek, Caroline Feikelday asks whether you think that by calling upon a standardized approach to search and rescue, the EU Commission could further try to criminalize civilian rescue organizations as new guidelines or requirements could be enforced. And whether the new migration pact will affect the migration camps in Aegean Islands and Bosnia and Herzegovina.
So Bernd.
Thank you. I'm not entirely sure about the standardized approach to search and rescue. I interpreted it in the first line with a specific concern by the European Commission that the rule of law does not apply to the European borders anymore. So you understand when the Commission affirms that the search and rescue, and particularly rescue, is not negotiable, that it is not something which is optional, but that there's a very fundamental international law obligation, very much not speaking about ethical and moral implications of search and rescue. I had the impression that the Commission really does understand that the impunity of criminalization of search and rescue, and this shows up in a different part of the document, the problem the Commission seems to have, the very slight problem the Commission seems to have with the proliferation of pushback practices all across Europe's borders. I would rather understand it as an attempt of the Commission to restore a certain kind of rule of law at the border. So I'm not entirely sure if it's a pretext for criminalization. I think that is a very valid reservation, which is something we should definitely keep looking into. But I would actually hope that it is not so. How it will affect the migration camps, I don't know. It is a bit. I was a bit curious. Okay, I cannot say much about what is happening in Bosnia and Herzegovina because it falls so much outside of the European border, even though it is in Europe, of course. There is a mention in the Commission document that Moria hotspot will be reconstructed as a joint European pilot project. So that the European Union, and I guess the European Commission, will be strongly involved in the creation and possibly also into the running of the burnt down Moria hotspot. And I am very, very ambivalent about it because, to be very honest, Moria hotspot has seen like an unusual high involvement of European agencies from the beginning. It was erected under the Europeanized hotspot approach. And I would say if the European Union really would have wanted to do something about the horrible and deplorable conditions that characterize not only Moria, but actually all of the hotspots on the Greek Aegean islands, something could have been done before. So it was not necessary for this camp to burn down. So at this point, I remain rather doubtful if more European involvement will actually lead to a necessary and decisive change. If I don't want to gobble up all the time, but just to answer quickly to the question on Migrants Agency, which I appreciate very much, I think the document is an anti-migration agency document. It speaks very, very strongly against the notion of, let's say, free will or options. It speaks very often about removing options or about threatening severe consequences when certain decisions, such as moving on, secondary movement in the European Union, is taken. It speaks a lot about swift and efficient and rapid procedures in order to leave very little space for individual or autonomous considerations to not to be part of the process or to remove oneself from the asylum procedure. I really do not see that there's much agency in there, except from what I have mentioned before, in that fundamentally the European Commission characterizes the territory of the European border as a territory where there is not an unlimited sovereignty emanating from the European Union. In that it recognizes that because there is another force at work, a force which we would refer to as the movements of migration, the European border will always remain in crisis and will always remain in trouble and will always call for reactive policies. That's, you can read very clearly in the Commission document, even though they wish to change that. So I would say fundamentally, there is a recognition of the agency of the movements of migration. But at the same time, there is a very deep-seated desire in the document to restrict this agency on an individual level as far as possible. Thanks.
Well, there is another question concerning, first of all, the mandatory border procedure, including in the Pact. So Athena Barzi is concerned about the human rights protection and especially whether some of the provisions are oriented to set thousands of asylum seekers out of the asylum procedure. And there is another question about the possibility that the new migration pact can solve or reduce the problem of the long waiting time to get decisions on the asylum seeker status. And finally, another question for Jean-Pierre concerning the human rights of displaced women victims of violence within the resettlement procedure.
Thank you, Paola. With this, I would say that we will have a sort of 2 minutes for panel presenters. So Chiara, Jean-Pierre, Bernd.
Sorry, Veronica, just the last questions.
There is another one as well. Ooh. Then
just a clarification.
Okay, go ahead.
Concerning the presentation of the last presentation. So whether the Frontex will be replicated by other EU agency on asylum.
Okay, now it's getting very challenging because we should try to answer in the last very few minutes. So I would say really 2 minutes for each of you. So Chiara, Jean-Pierre, Bernd and Umut, 2 minutes, and then we will just say goodbye. Yes. And if there's anything pending, just drop an email and I'm sure our panelists will be happy to dialogue.
I would like only to add a remark about search and rescue operation because there is a recommendation that is a no-binding act and the Commission is proposing not to criminalize the search and rescue operations also by NGOs or by humanitarian boats. And the proposal and the recommendation of the Commission aims to give guidelines to member states implementing the directive 2002 number 90 that is not very precise on the point, and in fact it has been implemented in different way in the member state. So the problem with the recommendation is only that it is not binding because otherwise it could be really very useful to avoid the legal acts as Italy has adopted in the last 2 years. About border procedure, I share the concern that has been written. The border procedure are really very strategic point in the pact. They are already there, border procedure, but they will be strengthening and applied to more asylum seekers, and they are all inside the aim, the goal to fight abusive asylum applications. And I think there is really a very high risk of violation of fundamental rights and access to the asylum system, the asylum procedure. The proposed, the draft regulation ask member states to provide only for one tier of judicial remedy, and this is completely in contrast, for instance, with the Italian constitution. So there are really very weak points in pre-screening procedure, border procedure, and I think we will have to look at these. Also, of course, we will have to look at how the regulation will be adopted, but I think that probably the European Parliament will ask for some change. I hope that the European Parliament will require some change. Thank you.
Jean-Pierre.
Yes, just very quickly on the question of gender and resettlement. So the recommendation doesn't go into particular groups that would be particularly promoted in the context of resettlement. It's worth noting, however, that if we go back to the 2016 proposal, there we have a list of vulnerable persons, and survivors of gender-based violence, for example, are listed as one of those categories. So we can see that there is that reading of it in the older legislation, but it's not in the recommendation. But it's not specifically excluded in the sense that the text of the recommendation is quite broad and vague. In any case, doesn't focus on any particular subgroup. I think the other thing to mention about the border procedure is the possibility that it allows for detention and the increased possibility of detention at the border. And I think that is one kind of problematic aspect of the pact as well. I think I can stop there.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. Umut, your turn.
Well, I mean, I don't have too much to add beyond, you know, what's already been said, but what I wanted to emphasize once again is the pact seems to be devising this legal migrant, and that's considered to be those who are coming to offer some talent or to come as, you know, labor migrants, and then leaving the rest almost like people to be fended off. In a way, for me, this was the most disturbing one. It seems like the European Union is trying to clean its hands of, you know, its humanitarian obligations and all its other obligations, considering the multilateral international treaties. So this is an angle that I'd like to emphasize, you know, once again in reading this document. And I'm quite interested to see actually how this is going to replicate itself in terms of the future migration policies.
Thank you, Umut. I think we share the same worries. And Bernd, your turn, your last few words.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Concerning the border procedure, I'm very, very worried because this is exactly what we have seen in Moria under the EU-Turkey deal, a general declaration that the vast majority of those arriving are not even entitled even to access the European, in this case, the Greek asylum system, and the fact that they are to be returned, which is then enforced through detention. So this is something that we already have. And if I hear Ylva Johansson, the Justice and Home Affairs Commissioner, herself a Swedish Social Democrat, declaring that 70 and 80% of people arriving at Europe's borders have no claim to asylum, then I think the border procedure, especially with the aspect of mandatory or possible detention, and the overarching emphasis of the pact on return will lead to the proliferation of Morias all across Europe's borders. So I think this is a very, very dangerous situation, which is kind of sketched out in the new pact. And I am not sure, I cannot see how the long waiting times for asylum decisions will be reduced. The pact speaks about speed all the time, swift decisions, rapid decisions, it's all over. But this has been promised for the last 20 years. This has been promised for 20 years of a European asylum system, and it has never materialized because it would mean to actually staff the asylum service properly and not to direct them as deportation machines, like we have seen in, over the last years, especially since 2015. And this also, to just use a couple of seconds on this, this also worries me very much about the impeding creation of the Union Agency of Asylum, which already exists halfway in EASO, the European Asylum Support Office. If you look at the phenomenon of European agencies, it creates a very specific executive order, which has fundamental problems in accountability and transparency, or if I can say it with a few bigger words, it's a problem for the democratic nature of the European state. And I am very worried that, like border protection has been outsourced by the European Union to the supposedly technocratic agency Frontex, and we have seen what are the results. They will attempt to do the same with fundamentally political decision. Who is supposed to find shelter and refuge and protection in the European Union, again, to a body which is in the history of the European Union designed to be a technocratic body, a regulatory body. And this is why I'm worried about this Union Agency for Asylum. This is why I'm speaking about the replication. You know, you take these issues which are so deeply political, you remove them from democratic political discourse, you stuff them into an agency, and you let them run their course. And I think this is very dangerous for Europe. This is what we have seen. This is what I think when Etienne Balibar says the borders of Europe are the borders of democracy, this is something he had in mind, and it's something we have to have in mind going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bernd. A quite strong way of concluding our discussion. I would thank all our speakers, so Professor Chiara Favilli, Professor Umut Korkut, Dr. Jean-Pierre Gauci, and Dr. Bernd Kasparek. Really, thank you so much. Thanks to all of you, and in particular to Paola and Serkis that have helped us as, you know, backstage and organization. And if I may finish with just inviting you to visit our website, the website of our research, Respond, and just to visit it and to sign up for our newsletter, because in the newsletters you will find all our events, and particularly through the newsletter you can enroll to our final conference that will be held virtually in Berlin at mid-November. So with this, I think we can stop now, and thank you once again for having shared with us your thoughts and for having added a piece of understanding of knowledge, and especially of critical knowledge, to what's happening around us in the field of migration. Have a nice evening, and thank you to all of you. Goodbye. Ciao, ciao, arrivederci.